Stepping out of my comfort zone and taking a break from combat tutorials, I thought it would be fun to do a tier list video instead, to kind of explore where the best decks rank after YCS Pittsburgh. Now this is my first time doing something like this, so I imagine that there's going to be blunders. That's why I'm counting on you to point them out so we can grow the channel together. Let's get into the list. So before we get into the list, I just thought it would be a good idea to go over what the tiers actually are so we're all on the same page as we go through it. So tier 1 will refer to the best decks in the room. Like statistically speaking, these are the decks that you should expect to face, and they're also the decks that should make up the predominant top cut. Like most of the top 8 should be in tier 1. Tier 1.5 is decks that is just not quite tier 1, they're not quite tier 2 either, they're just somewhere in between. I feel as though it's something that we should kind of put in because tier 2, in my opinion, is generally considered to be like the standard. If you're going to like a YCS or Nationals or that kind of thing, you need to think that your deck is at least tier 2 to compete. Like it is the baseline. Rogue is not necessarily worse than tier 2, but what it means is that it's a deck that kind of needs a little something to push it ahead. Like if things align with it, like if the stars align, you should be good. By this I mean is that decks that in Rogue generally need you to kind of, you'll generally be playing a deck that maybe your opponent isn't too familiar with, and you can kind of capitalize on the ignorance. That will help you go pretty far. Another way to think of Rogue is that some decks need to win the die roll, and if you are winning the die roll every time, then expect the deck that is in Rogue to do really well. It might even make top gun. I have put a tier for Skip. I'm not saying that the decks that are in Skip are bad. I just think that where the format is now, I think they don't do enough to kind of compete with the rest of the deck. Like they don't have a very clear, well-defined win con. It doesn't mean you can't do well with them. It just means that you should probably think about playing something else, because if you is in Skip, it probably means you'll be working a lot harder than the rest of the composition to only achieve a fraction of what their deck does. Okay, we're not out of the way, let's take a look at the list. So I thought we could start off with the obvious, and that would be the decks that are in tier 1. You'll notice that I've put these 4 decks in, and these are the 4 that made up the top 8 at YCS Pittsburgh. Now I think Draco Tail is probably the best deck in the room. I'm not talking about the engine itself, because if you look at Draco Tail as a deck, it's very mid-range, right? What is helping people win with this deck is more the non-engine that they're playing that kind of helps them capitalize on the knowledge that they have, so they can accurately disrupt their opponent to help propel their strategy above anything in the competition, right? So they basically play a lot of disruption. They basically stop your opponent from playing, and then they play on their own turn. So it plays very low to the ground, but when your opponent's not playing, that's, you know, basically everything you need. I think this is kind of characteristic of Yu-Gi-Oh! Whenever we see a format sort of reaching its end, we see a lot of these mid-range, high hand trap count decks doing exceptionally well, and they generally tend to be piloted by players with a lot of knowledge, right? Like we saw DTR win with this. We've also seen people like Joshua Smith and Jesse Carton all play decks like Draco Tail in the past. I'm talking about mid-range decks that just have space for every hand trap imaginable, and that just seems to be the way things go. Whenever a new format starts, people play a ton of breakers, people are scared, but as things come to a close, decks are solved. If you know what you can do with your hand traps, you're generally going to do well. Now, I think it is definitely the deck to beat, because it did win my YCS Pittsburgh. That drew a lot of attention to itself, but I think you may not have known, but this weekend there's also the German and French Open, and Draco Tail won both of those too. So yeah, it's definitely the best deck in the room, at least for now, and I think a lot of times people will now need to think of how they can play through the huge disruption tools that Draco Tail has. I think something that separates Draco Tail from other mid-range decks is that it also has a lot of ways to play while going second. Like if you read any of the Draco Tail cards, they do better when they go in second, right? But the deck itself isn't geared to doing second, it just benefits when it does go second. So it's very well rounded, and that seems to be everything pilots need right now. In second place, I kind of put in the Yami variant. So there's a lot of Self-Record Yami, Mitsurugi Yami. That's why I put Mitsurugi next to it. And it's a good deck, right? It's very good. Like if we talk about the end board, it's just crazy because it has basically all the disruption it needs in the world, but it has to get to sort of that end board or at least the half board to do any of those things. That's kind of put Yami in, I wouldn't say a bad position. I'm saying it's just behind Draco Tail, because a lot of people are kind of prepared for these fields. They either have like the hand trap knowledge to prevent you from getting to that field, or they're playing breakers that kind of just get rid of that field altogether. I know that Yami can end on Herald of the Arclight, but one Omni Negate doesn't really feel like it does enough anymore, especially when decks now have in-engine tools of removing fields. Like, I'm just using Mitsurugi as an example. They have Murakumo, right? So they can just bait with the board breaker. You have to use the Arclight, and if they get to a Murakumo, then it's very difficult for you to play through. I have put Mitsurugi here. I do think Yami Mitsurugi is probably the best variant of both of these decks. next would be Yami Sulfur Cord, and I think some weird things like Orcust Mitsurugi and K9 Mitsurugi. I think there is an argument to put in Mitsurugi in tier 1.5 if we're talking about it as a pure deck or as a variant, but it is a deck that you have to respect. So I feel as though we have to put in tier 1, especially when we consider that a lot of people are dedicating their side decks just for Mitsurugi. Lunalight, it's tier 1, right? At this point, like, it's been in and out of the format for a while. It's been doing well for itself. We always see it kind of take up these top 8 spots, or sometimes the regional scene will see it win. It is kind of a deck that, like, the less prepared people are for it, the better it does, but the more attention it draws for itself, the worse it does. So I think the trend we've seen with Lunalight is that it'll top like an event, it won't top the next event, and then it tops the event afterwards. So it's sort of like every buy event kind of thing it kind of does well. Liger is obviously an incredible card, and if you can get to that, you generally win because most decks are just not prepared to deal with it. And even if they are, a lot of times it requires them to draw a dedicated out, especially when you think that the only real extra deck out to Liger right now is Underworld Goddess, and if you end into Liger, your opponent is only going to be able to get rid of one of them. So yeah, it's absolutely good. It plays through hand traps and pretty well. You obviously don't really care about board breakers too much because your end field is just so good. It can play through Malcharmers, it can take up a lot of challenges. It's just that it is in a place where decks that open like 2-3 hand traps will almost always prevent you from getting to a Liger, so you always need to think how to make the max of your hand. I have shown replays where I played this deck and I've played through like 3-4 hand traps, but I think that's the difference between playing against someone online and versus a skill pilot. Like, we've seen Aditya when he played against Lunalight in the top 8 feature. Yes, he did make the misplay, but a lot of times we did not see a single Liger throughout that entire duel, right? Even though he lost game 2, there was no Liger, and that's just because he had the hand trap knowledge to kind of prevent it, and that's something that I feel is like holding Lunalight back a little bit. So even though I feel it is a strong tier 1 contender, I hesitate to put it a bit higher, but that could just be me trying to counteract my bias, because if I had my way, I'd put it at the top of the list, but I'm trying to be a little bit fair, so maybe a good compromise of putting it at the bottom of tier 1. Next, I want to talk about the decks in the skip tier. So like I said, these are decks that are definitely not bad by any means. I just feel as though they don't have a clear win con, and I think a lot of these decks don't really do so. Like Labyrinth, I know is a deck that can be rogue, it can be very well, but I think a lot of people are playing a lot of breakers in the side deck, which means that Labyrinth kind of struggles to stick to the field right now. A lot of decks can also just OTK on the fly, and it feels very difficult for Labyrinth to kind of excel in a format where there's so much removal. Same with Fluent Reese. I think, the argument is if we're in a link format, there's a way that Fluent Reese can be kind of act as a sort of an anti-meta deck of sorts. We kind of saw the German Open, I think it was round 6 or round 5, it kind of finished at X1. So it was doing pretty okay for itself, so there is an argument that a skill pilot can do well with it, but again, it's just, I feel as though it's not really doing enough right now. Like, Fluent Reese has always been carried by things like Dimension Shifter and Harpy's Featherstorm, and because, well, we don't have 3 Dimension Shifter anymore, the deck already took an indirect hit, and it's kind of hard to say that, yeah, the deck can just win if it draws Featherstorm or searches Featherstorm every game. But there are so many decks that can get to Featherstorm with Thrust and like a rank 1 Bird thing or rank 4 Castel. So I hesitate to put it higher. Obviously, you can prove me wrong by by showing me that you can win a YCS with this deck. I just hesitate to think that it would be any better than this. So I don't recommend it, but it is there. Eldritch is, again, the same thing as Malice. It's always been kind of like a worse version of Malice, and then Eldritch was kind of always carried by the floodgates it could play and things like Lava Golem that help you kind of clear the field. Now it obviously has these good tools that can clear the field like Lava Golem Sphere Mode, but it is not really doing too much that you could actually argue that it could do well at a major event. Rescue Ace is a bit of a special one because right now I'm thinking that people should skip on it because it's very difficult to play the deck with the engines available, but as soon as it gets the new support, it should be a mid-range deck that people need to keep an eye out for. Same with RB. I think some people are playing this with Sky Striker at Pittsburgh, and there is sort of an argument that this kind of works, but again, you have to ask yourself, is Sky Striker better with RB or is it better without? I think a lot of people argue that Sky Striker basically pure or without RB is a lot better, so that's kind of the reason why I put it in skip. It could be better, it could be worse. Augusta, I'm just going to jump over there. I still don't know what this deck does, right? There's some people that have been trying to tinker with it, like they've been playing Augusta, Sky Striker and things like that. It just feels like sort of a deck that is carried by its art and nothing else. Sorry, Augusta community, but I just don't know what it does just yet. Like, it might prove me wrong when it gets new support or something, but that's just where the deck kind of feels for me. Sprites and Melodious I feel could be Rogue, but the reason why I'm putting it here is because, again, it doesn't really have a clear win con, right? Melodious has a board that's very hard to crack, except that the board breakers that people are playing now, like Super Poly, Dark Ruler, Droplet, all just deal with the board. So you basically invest in like your whole hand if you don't open Ostinata to establish a board, and your opponent can just very easily crack through them. Same with Sprites, it plays a lot of bricks, and the end board isn't really too negate heavy. Like you have your red, you have your carrot, those kinds of things. But I feel as though it doesn't have enough protection to deal with the things, especially in the world where people are already prepared for Yummy, which feels like a better version of Sprite. So I think we'll put in the skip category for now. Things could change. I know the skill pilots who have been doing pretty well with Melodious, but again, I feel as though they're kind of like the outlier. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but you know, again, feel free to prove me wrong. Okay, now that we can start with the first deck of the list, I'm probably going to put Rytron in Rogue. Like a lot of people might ask me why I'm putting Rytron in Rogue and not Skip, and that's because, well, I'm going to be open and say that I'm a little bit biased as far as Rytron is concerned because I really like the deck. But I feel as though it has a bit more of a win con than the decks in Skip, right? So Rytron, obviously it can do the Secret Village lock, it has Vanity's Ruler, so it has two well-established win cons that it can both search, that can kind of like close the game out if it's going first and it can get to these cards. Apart from that, Rytron feels very good in the sense that it can play through a lot of the hand traps that people are playing. It's the most proficient user of Droplet in the game, I think, next to Crystron. Like I would argue that Crystron is a better user, but you know, it's such a slight difference that like Rytron can just capitalize on Droplet, which is one of the best breakers in the field in the game right now. And it also is able to establish a pretty good board. Like I said, you have your spell lock. If you're not going the spell lock, you are able to end on like 5 monster negates plus 4 monster negates, a spell trap negate, and 1 disruption, which is pretty good, especially as like a 1.5 card combo. The thing that's holding Rytron back, for one, is that it doesn't have a lot of room for non-engine. Like traditionally this deck isn't meant to play a lot of hand traps, but it generally plays a lot of breakers to kind of tear your opponent's field and then set up from there. Now it is able to win with engine alone, but you do sometimes need like 1 or 2 breakers in your hand because it really helps in that regard, and it just doesn't play enough. Like I think the decks that I've experimented with, I played like a Rytron list that was running 41 cards, and it had like space for maybe 11 non-engine, which just doesn't feel like enough in this current format. So yeah, it obviously has a good win con, but a bit of a weakness there because it can't run the non-engine. It also is somewhat weak to board breakers, right? All of your interruption is kind of on the field in your monster zone if you don't have the spell village on the field. And if your opponent Dark Rulers, that's probably it. Like you're not going to do anything else there. And yeah, so it is something that can take people by surprise. It can play really good breakers in Lava Golem Sphere mode and things like that. But otherwise, it's just kind of dragging its feet a little bit. So yeah, I think it's a perfect representation of Rogue because if your opponent doesn't know, you can basically win games. But if they do know and they know like to save the negate for the Fafnir, the Exceed, then you're probably in a bit of a weird situation. Next up, I want to talk about Malice, and I'm putting Malice in the tier 1.5 category. It is a deck that is taking a lot of people by surprise, right? Because after the ban list, people thought that Malice was dead, right? It lost a lot of its consistency tools, and well, we kind of saw it fall out of favor for a while. But recently it's been coming back, and I think a big reason for this is because people have stopped side decking Lancia, and because of that, Malice has really been able to pop off, and it is doing pretty well for itself at like a regional level. We're also seeing it at a YCS level. We're not really seeing it top too much, but in a lot of the feature matches, it is holding its own against a lot of the best decks. And I feel though it's kind of deserving of this 1.5 slot because it can take people by surprise, especially if they're not prepared for it. Now, in terms of end board, I think the Malice end board is probably on tier 1 level, but the reason why I'm not putting it in tier 1 is because it is somewhat inconsistent, right? It has lost a lot of its consistency tools, and because of that, it is not as reliable as the decks in the top, the top tables. It can get there, don't get me wrong, and it is definitely doing a lot better than everyone thought, but I think it's just slightly short from making tier 1. Next up, I want to talk about White Forest, right? I think White Forest is a solid tier 2 deck because it's like kind of the baseline, right? White Forest does a lot. Like the end board is very, very, very strong. I would argue that it's probably on the same level as Malice, like if you can get to the end board uninterrupted. But unfortunately, White Forest is in a bit of a weird spot because it is kind of catching strays from both the hate that people are playing for Yami and Mitsurugi, right? In a world where those decks are not popular, we can argue that White Forest could be tier 1, but the problem is that a lot of people are already main decking and side decking role for Mitsurugi in a lot of the decks in the format. And because of that, as a White Forest pilot, if your opponent resolves that draw, it's very difficult for you to play through. And that just means you're out here catching strays, right? Similarly, the deck is somewhat like Yummy. It kind of like commits a lot to the field, and then it has like a ton of interruption that kind of breaks your or prevents your opponent from playing. And that is kind of a problem when it kind of loses to the same breakers that Yummy does, right? So yeah, I know that White Forest has the field spell card. It also has the White Witch, which collectively give you battle and card destruction protection. But things like a Dark Ruler no more will completely like ruin your life. Like you will commit everything to the board, your opponent will Dark Ruler, and there's not really much you can do from there. The deck has one Omni Negate, kind of like Yummy. It gets to that Omni Negate very early, but it is a bit of a challenge when you only have the one Omni Negate and you can't really play through multiple breakers, especially in a format where people are playing breakers that you can't respond to. Like Dark Ruler, Droplet, Super Poly are they're just the pits for you, right? And unfortunately, those things kind of hold the deck back. I do think like tier 2 in terms of power, but yeah, that is kind of the argument why I hesitate to put it higher. Very, very baseline deck. I love the deck, I've been playing it a lot, but yeah, it is unfortunately behind the decks at the top table. Next, I want to talk about DDD, right? And I think DDD is a solid tier 2 deck. It's probably ahead of White Forest. Very similar to White Forest, is like the deck that can do, it's a deck that can do so much when going first. It has a crazily strong end board, but it is out here catching strays from the hate that people are playing for Yami and Mitsuru. It does have somewhat of a weakness to draw. Unlike White Forest, it can still do something under a draw, but it is something that drastically lowers the ceiling of your end board, and it's very difficult for you to win games when your opponent resolves the draw. Similarly, it has a lot of negates, right? But a lot of these turn-ending negates, or these negates that your opponent can just activate that you can't respond to, kind of deal with your board. So yeah, it is definitely better than White Forest, but I feel as though it needs a little something to change before it can make tier 1 and tier 1.5. I think playing Impulse is obviously something that somewhat of an advantage that a lot of decks don't have, but is it enough to push it forward? And that's the question I ask myself all the time. Blue Eyes is straight up rogue. It's a very good deck, and I feel as though there's an argument to saying that if Dragatail is doing well, Blue Eyes should be able to do well too, right? Because they have this very similar end board, they're both mid-range, and they both play a ton of hand traps that kind of disrupt your opponent to prevent them from playing. I think the key differences between Blue Eyes and Dragatail though is that Blue Eyes is unfortunately not as good going second. It doesn't have the same tools that Dragatail has, and it also has a weakness to things like Golden Lockbird, Nibiru, and Bastiles, which are all in the format. So those things are kind of, in my opinion, holding the deck back. But sad to say that, considering how cool the deck is, and it is also a bit bricky, so definitely a worse version of Dragatail, but if you can go through an event where your opponent never resolves draw against you, you can probably do about as well as Dragatail. So Gemini's a bit of a weird one, and I'm not entirely sure where to put it. So currently it is the best going second deck in the format, so I feel as though it should go in tier 1.5, just because if it is allowed to like lose the die, it's allowed to lose the die roll and then still do pretty well during game 1, and because of that it's very well positioned in a sense. But the problem is post-siding, a lot of people are going to make you go first, and there's not a lot you can do right now. So in the past you could rely on things like Protoss, Dimension Barrier, and a lot of the turn skips that win the format, but now they're gone. So you're basically not doing a whole lot when going first, especially when considering the amount of board breakers that are in the format and just the sheer abundance of hand traps. It just means that the deck is probably not going to do a whole lot. And so that kind of like makes me think that it should go into Rogue, but it's also too good to be in this tier because again, it is allowed to lose the die roll. So I'm putting it in tier 2, I'm not entirely sure where, so I'll move it around as we need to. Right now I think we'll put it in between DDD and White Forest because those two decks are kind of competing for the same spot, and this does something a bit different. While we're talking about going second decks, I think Millennium Exodia is one that deserves recognition, and I'm putting it here in Rogue. It is basically a better and worse version of Gem Knight, so going second it doesn't do as much as Gem Knight, but it can steal games in the same way that Gem Knight does, being able to OTK out of nowhere. It's better than Gem Knight in the sense that it has a good going first strategy, or at least a viable one, right? Because your Exodia is somewhat of a tower. You have the Grave effect of the Blue Eyes looking card, and you have the Exod trap card, which kind of nukes the field. So it does have some interrupter and force to go first, which feels that it's better than Gem Knight. But the reason why I'm putting in Rogue below it is because one, a lot of people don't know about it, and if they don't, you can kind of steal games. But mainly because it is forced to play 5 bricks, and because of that, it is a little on the inconsistent side. So putting in Rogue, steal games, might be a better consideration than Gem Knight. but this is something that we'll have to see in time. I'm putting Sky Striker in tier 1.5, but probably at the bottom of it. Like the decks in tier 2, it does have a weakness to Duel, and I feel as though that is something that you always need to think about when playing Sky Striker, but it also has just so much versatility that it can kind of justify playing it over something else, and it is something that demands respect, right? As we saw it do fantastically at Worlds, it's been sneaking tops here and there, and it's just great all around. And with Burst Protocol around the corner, it is soon to skyrocket to tier 1, so I think people need to start preparing for it now, and the best way to show respect to that would be putting it just below tier 1 for now. While you were looking, I kind of rearranged the skip tier and I put Voiceless Voice in, and now it's kind of strange to see Voiceless in the skip tier, but I think the argument has always been that it's just the worst version of Blue Eyes. So I think it's something that you should probably not consider playing when Blue Eyes is such a viable option. But for those of you who are dedicated fans to it, you can still do pretty well with it, but I think you would then need to pair it with Mitsurugi. I'm putting Orcust in tier 2, but I'm probably at the bottom of tier 2, so it's kind of a deck that hasn't really been fully solved because there's just been so many variants of people trying it. And it's good, but it feels as though it is lacking a little something. So a lot of times it is paired with Mitsurugi, which will then push it a lot higher. But it's also actually a catching strays from things like Malice, because people are now citing Lancia for Malice, and when they're not citing Lancia, you still fall victim to the Bastilles that people are playing. So it's good, not great. Feels as though we need to spend a little bit more time with it to kind of figure out how to crack it. But for now, I think tier 2 is a safe place to put it. I would hesitate to put in Rogue because a lot of people know what Orcus do, and it is just a little bit stronger than the things over there. Tombkeeper is definitely tier 1.5. I'd probably put it between Sky Striker and Malice. It's very good. We've seen it win a YCS, and there's so many variants of it. Even decks that aren't playing pure Tombkeeper are finding ways to splash it into basically everything they're playing. Like over the weekend, we saw people splash a Silhouette and a Puffer's package into K9. And also, I think a Yami Mitsurugi player who just found a way to squeeze this in. So it is something that garners a lot of respect. It's kind of cool to see a trap deck that is still kind of competing. I think it is something that the more people are aware of, the worse it does. But for now, it is still catching people by surprise because people are just putting it in whatever they can. And it seems to be helping them against breakers at the least, and that's always a good consideration. Now there's a couple of decks I want to talk about together because I feel as though they do more or less the same thing. So those will be Mermail, which I'm putting somewhere around here. Branded, which I will put somewhere around there, and Hero, let me see if I can find that. And Hero, which will probably be at the top of Rogue, or at least in the middle, somewhere around there. So these three decks basically all do the same thing. So they all have a turn skip. So Mermail has, the water statue, Branded has the Eido statue, and Hero has a couple. It has I think it's the Dark Angel that stops your opponent from using spell cards. It has Plasma, which stops monster effects, and then it has Dark Claw, which basically is a Macrocosmos with legs. And they're all very good. So all three of these decks have a viable going first strategy, but they're also somewhat weak to breakers because they don't really end on any kind of viable negate, right? Branded kind of gets away with that, which is why it's ahead of Hero, because it has layered interrupts, so it's able to play even under some kind of board breaker your opponent might throw at you, so it still has some play even though the breaker does hurt them. Mermail, which I put the highest of the three, doesn't really have a way to deal with the board breaker that your opponent just hard has, but unlike the others, it is able to hand rip your opponent for like I think 2 or 3, which means that it is less likely that your opponent has a breaker plus a starter, so they are generally not going to be able to out your statue while breaking your board, but there are going to be games where they just might top deck the right thing off the top and then they just get to play, right? So it garners respect. I don't think we've seen too much of it lately. I think in the last month or so we saw it top a regional, make top 4 somewhere. So I think it has the best showing of the 3, which is why I'm putting it a little bit higher. I don't know if it's better than White Forest. I think White Forest we've seen a lot more than Mermail, so maybe I should put it like that. But I guess you could say these two are kind of interchangeable. I'm putting K9 at the top of tier 1.5 just because I feel as though it isn't just quite there or as well as the tier 1 decks. Like the tier 1 decks I kind of reserved for those who made top 8 at Pittsburgh. Like those are the only decks I think that made playoffs this weekend. And K9 unfortunately didn't. It has been doing pretty well. I think it won a regional 2, one in Germany and somewhere else. It's still very viable considering that there are just so many K9 options and which will always keep your opponent guessing. But I think the thing that holds it back from being tier 1 is that outside of Zeus, it doesn't really have a viable going second strategy. So a lot of times you are kind of relying on having the Izuna or some kind of hand traps or interrupt for your opponent. And when you don't, it can be a bit difficult. So it is somewhat dependent on the die roll. So just put it behind because of that. I'm putting Memento in tier 2. I'm just not exactly sure where to put it. So for now, I'm just going to put it maybe ahead of Branded, but I think it's okay. I'm putting it in front of Bowmill because I think it garners a lot of respect. So Memento is kind of like fallen off. I'm saying fallen off in terms of popularity instead of rather playability, because it's still as good as it's ever been. It hasn't really lost anything. I think we're at the point now where it's been around for so long that people know what it does, so it is having a bit of a harder time. Like before, it kind of excelled because I kind of described the deck as like parkour. Instead of like walking in a straight line, it kind of like loops in and out of the field, the graveyard, the deck. The extra deck, it just does a whole lot of things that kind of confuses your opponent so that they're not entirely sure where they should spend the interruption. But now it's kind of like generally accepted that the safest places to use your interrupts against Memento would be against the cards that fusion summon, right? They only have 2 of those. You can do that. You can kind of stop them from gaining a lot of advantage, and that's something that kind of holds, I wouldn't say holds the deck back, but people have become adapted to so that it is a bit harder for it to have success. There's also been kind of debates on what version of it to play. Like people are still playing the Fiendsmith version that is using the rank 3 Jin thing, or they're playing the K9 version. In my opinion, the K9 version is not exactly great because it is somewhat bricky. Like both Akihiron and the horse can summon itself, so you don't really need anything from the K9 package to help facilitate that. It already has a way to deal with hand traps, and it has a bolting, well, not a bolting way, but the deck has been designed to kind of dodge Nibiru using IP, so there aren't really any variant that kind of sticks as well as it used to. Like even the Goblin Biker variant had success because Raziel was the best deck in the room. And one of those things, it is kind of at a place where it feels as though it is the baseline, like it just competes with every deck in the room, but it is very skill dependent, and you still do rely on some things like your opponent not having a breaker or you being able to make the Mirage Light and still have a fairy in hand to kind of negate. If you don't do those things, it can be tough. So a bit of a weird place, but I think it can still take a lot of people by surprise. The last couple of decks are all rogues. I'm just going to put them in and then I'll kind of slot them where they're supposed to be a bit later. And I'll talk about them as we go through. So Punk, again, it hasn't really been solved. Like it was played a lot with Fiendsmith, and then even then it wasn't completely viable. It was something that was catching a lot of people by surprise. It had a good board, pretty consistent. It has lost the moon, so it's not as good. But I feel as though it's just because the deck hasn't been solved. Like it just needs some more time for people to figure out, and then when they do, it can shoot up to tier 2. So I'm going to put it here in the middle for now. Raziel Onomat has kind of fallen off a little bit hard because it lost the hand loop, it lost the turn skip, it's lost a lot of things. Like it seems as though every time there's a ban list, Konami finds a way to hit Raziel. And I'm just not entirely sure what it does right now besides make Detonator and a few other things. Like we're obviously playing it with Onomat, so it gives it some more viability, but again, you're playing a deck that is running so many bricks, and I feel as though it's just kind of dragging its feet behind Blue Eyes. Like I guess some people will say that if you're competent with Raziel, you could probably put it ahead and have similar success to Dracotail, but I feel as though it is just held back by so many things right now. So let me just put it maybe next to Blue Eyes, just say that they're interchangeable, but I guess it is something that we'll see with time. As for Fire King, I don't know a whole lot about the deck to be honest, but I do know that Dinkabu, who's probably the best Fire King player, has obviously said that all of the times he's had success with the deck has been because his opponent didn't really know what the deck does, and because of his continuous success with it, a lot of people are becoming more familiar with it, so you're kind of hoping that your opponent doesn't to sort of have some kind of success with it. The Jurak package obviously helps, it gives it some way to play during turn 0, but again, a lot of decks are kind of prepared for turn 0 plays, so unless you open the exact 2-card combo, it is very difficult, and the argument is then you're relying on a 2-card combo to do what Nibiru already does. So I guess the advantage is that you get to play 6 Nibiru. Is that really what we want to be doing though? And then Pearly, it's definitely Rogue because it's doing exactly the same thing as Lunalight. It's just that a lot of people don't know what it does, so it kind of can catch people off guard if they don't know. But if they do, the same things that out Lunalight are going to out you. It also doesn't have as much push as Lunalight, so it is very, very Rogue. Live Turn is something that I feel can do very well. I kind of want to put it here, so I am. Like the Blue Eyes, it plays a lot of hand traps. It doesn't really have a viable going second option like most of the decks in Rogue, but it is still pretty cool. It has the Fiendsmith package, which gives it good amount of recursion, and it's incredibly consistent. I think the biggest weakness would always be Charmies because you can't really end on a half board with this deck without giving your opponent at least like 2-3 draws. And when you go full combo, it's something like 7 or 10 draws, somewhere around there. Which isn't exactly what you want to do with a mid-range deck, where you kind of like wear your opponent out to try and kind of create a simplified board state. So I think it deserves respect, but does it deserve the top of the Rogue? I don't know. I guess that's something we'll need to see more of, and unfortunately we aren't really seeing any of it right now. We've seen some Blue Eyes, we've seen some Ryzeal, we haven't seen some Hero and Exodia, even Fire King, so I guess I'm putting it somewhere there with the 4 outliers at the bottom. But yeah, that aside, this has been my tier list. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I know I stumbled a lot while making this. This is definitely something that is a bit out of my depth, but I think as I become more familiar with it, I'll be able to bring you guys better and better content. So yeah, let me know what you think. Where can I improve? And if there's any deck I missed, you can just also let me know. Thanks again, and I'll check you guys in the next.